So where we get up to now is we're going to have a presentation by Professor Danny Sampson. We're very fortunate this morning to have a number of keynote speaks to address the issue of innovation. Professor Sampson is currently the Professor of Management at the University of Melbourne. He's done extensive work on business improvement, major projects and change management for government, major companies and financial services. So Danny, we welcome you and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation very much to be here. Actually, I do have a pitch, and my pitch is going to be a little bit longer than the last 5 or 6, and I'm envious of you, especially the rocket scientists who have just been pitching. But my pitch is actually for organisational innovation excellence, and what I'd like to do is give you a broader perspective, because I get to study innovation excellence much more broadly than just in the defence sector, but I have got to study best practices a couple of years ago in the defence sector. I wrote a review of the DiggerWorks case study with a colleague in the defence sector, which was a business model innovation that really is, as far as I can tell, and I can, because I study all sorts of industries, it really was an example of world's best practice right here in our defence sector. And one of the interesting lessons from that, I'm going to be working with the GPSL, it's one of our university programs, University of Melbourne programs that we run inside DST this afternoon, was to think about how such best practice examples of organisational innovation excellence can be learnt from, what are the insights, and how can we broaden and adapt those things even further. So my agenda for the next 20 or so minutes is to speak about systematic innovation. What do we mean by that idea? I'll define that in a moment. I'd like to talk about innovation management at a number of different levels. This all comes, by the way, from studying innovation in a wide variety of organisations, including, for example, in the private sector, one of the darlings, in my view, of the Australian Stock Exchange, which is a company called CSL. If any of you were smart enough or lucky enough to have bought, I see a few people nodding with big grins on their face, and good for you. If you were lucky enough to buy CSL just about any time in the past, you'll notice that their share price just doubles and doubles and doubles and keeps on doubling, and what a wonderful thing. Well, I wrote a case study about that company to try and understand why and how that happened, and there's a very simple one-word answer, and it's innovation. They are excellent in their business and performance outcomes in every respect because they are excellent at innovation. I'm going to add a couple of other words to it, which are innovation capability, which delivers the stream of innovations that they have, and the word I'd like to put in front of that is the word systematic. It's not a case of just having the occasional lucky break. They work at it, and the other example that we're all familiar with, which is a company that doesn't just have the occasional lucky break, but has a systematic innovation capability, is of course Apple, who have a stream of things coming out which are very successful. That's products and services. It doesn't just happen as a matter of luck, not at all. It comes because of their systematic innovation capability. I'd like to talk a little further at the project level about how to select and how these great organisations choose which projects to invest in and take tough, I'll call them stage gate, go, no-go decisions about which practices and which projects to cut, as well as I've developed that from learning from best practices, and then talk a little bit about the systematic innovation capability elements. So can we break it down into some components? And the answer is yes, we can. Just very briefly, going back to some first principles, but I'm going to go very fast. Top right-hand little bubble there. What do we mean by innovation? Well, it's actually any aspect of an organisation or indeed an industry. So it can be new products or services, it can be processes, it can be organisational methods. When I think about DiggerWorks, it was really a new business model that then developed and delivered in with amazing effectiveness and speed some wonderful new products which our soldiers benefited from. I also want to point out, top left bubble, that when innovation is well led, the wonderful thing about it is that there's no limit, whereas there is a limit to cost reduction. You take out all of the waste, you take out all of the fat from a system or an organisation, and you start getting to the point whereby you're starting to cut muscle, and direct cost reduction has its limits. Same thing with quality, but with innovation, there is no limit. The sky's the limit. So I just ask you to think for a moment more broadly. Does anyone like to tell me that we've already innovated everything that's ever going to happen on one of these things, on our phones, or in, for example, another industry I'm familiar with is pharmaceuticals, the science of the human body? And the answer is no, we're only just really at the starting edge of that. So there's some examples of the idea that innovation doesn't have a limit. Leadership in organisations is about influencing people, and the reason that I mention that is to just remind you that despite all of the advances in artificial intelligence, I don't think we're there yet at the point whereby we'll be able to say that machines can do innovation nearly as well as the lateral thinking and creative processes, and also, very importantly, the commercialisation capabilities that come from human ingenuity. So, just very briefly, we've been working on this for a long time. I've actually been working in the field of innovation for something like 40 years, or maybe it's 400. But anyway, I started as an R&D engineer a long time ago. That's why I'm so envious of, I miss the technical work, envious of the rocket scientists. But I just want to say that in my first experience, I found a huge gulf in my organisation. It was a multinational chemical company, ICI, and a huge gulf between what us R&D engineers were doing and what was happening in the main chemical plants. Later I got to work in one of the chemical plants and looked at it from the other end. So the first point I'd like to make is about the distinction between the new stream and the mainstream of an organisation. We can apply this at an organisational level, we can apply this at the enterprise level, we can apply it also at the industry level, and since we're here today, let's talk about the defence industry. And this is one of the things that DiggerWorks did so very well. So down the bottom of this image, I'd like to just mention the mainstream, and the mainstream of defence is obvious to what it all is. It's where we actually do our defence work. The new stream, and it's just a slight oversimplification, is where DST and CSIRO and universities are doing new stream work. These terms were coined by a Harvard professor. And where I found a long time ago in the chemical industry, and I found it much more recently in some other industries, is that the crucial success factor is how well the new stream and the mainstream are, or indeed are not connected in terms of understanding each other's, understanding the different values, the different cultures, the different measures, and being able to work together. And that's already been alluded to this morning, so I'll just move more quickly. In the private sector, there was resentment where I first worked about the money that had to be generated by the mainstream to fund the new stream. Because what is the return from that new stream? And there is resentment. I've just done a review inside the defence sector about the same sorts of things. And the return has to be expressed in terms of ideas. So one of the things I'd like to unpack a little bit is how do we know when we have an idea, an innovative idea about something new and different, and that's not a bad little working definition of innovation, how do we know which are the most promising and valuable ideas as against the ones that we should say, no, can't do them all, and that one goes on the back burner? I'd like to come to that. I also want to point out that in great organisations in any industry, that what it's really all about is the leadership of the integration of this whole thing as a system. So I come back to that term, the systematic innovation capability, which I'd now like to define. So what I found in world-class organisations that are excellent, such as CSL, from an innovation perspective, is actually, I wish there was less, because simple is always better, but I'd like to define 4 levels at which we can see that, and I'd like to have us think through perhaps about how that applies in the defence sector. The first one is the role and contribution of innovation in the organisation, or in this case the defence sector's overall strategy and goals, and there's been a lot of work done and white papers released in respect of the defence sector there. The next thing is to, once we understand how innovation is going to contribute to the overall effectiveness of the organisation, is to focus in on the innovation strategy itself. What is the innovation focus going to be? The next level, the third level down, is to manage the portfolio of projects and ultimately to manage the projects one at a time. So excellence in project management is the execution mechanism for doing innovation well. But we've got to manage the portfolio, we've got to connect the portfolio to the overall mainstream strategy, and then it comes down to excellence at the project by project level. And of course, the fourth connecting point comes down, as I've got on the bottom there, is the idea of people wanting to, In other words, being motivated to, and also having the skills and the understanding about the challenges, the complexity, the benefits, the costs and the risks associated with doing innovation work. Now, the most important thing to say about all of those things, well, firstly, I just want to say you can measure all those things. Haven't got time to go into the details of measuring all those things. The most important thing I want to say about those things is that I'm sure, and I've worked with Bruce Handford on this, I'm sure that these things do adapt very nicely into the defence sector and that they don't act alone. So perhaps the crispest way that I can speak about a systematic innovation capability is to have the verticals connected between those four levels, all the way from the defence strategy to the defence innovation strategy to the portfolio of projects to the individual projects, and we just heard a number of pitches about at the individual project level, and that's at the third level that I was speaking about before, down to the fourth level about the individual people and their contribution and their understanding about how that all fits together. It's the fitting together of all of those levels that I'd like to label the systematic innovation capability. It's that connection. Just as a side issue, I've recently had the pleasure of spending 2 years working closely with a company that I believe to be one of the world's very best companies, Toyota, and they use a Japanese word, not just Toyota, use that word, which I'd like to refer to, which is Hoshin, and it's about that connection and deployment from the very highest level, in the case of Toyota, from the president of Toyota to every single worker who might be a factory worker or somebody working in sales and service, and that connection and that deployment is what makes for an excellent system. So those tight vertical connections is something that I don't think we can overly emphasise and make sure that that's in place. Otherwise, what happens is a lot of things slip between the cracks, and I've seen lots and lots of waste in innovation systems, in waste in the connection between new stream and mainstream in organisations, in industries and in sectors, and perhaps I might just give you a quick example of what I mean by what happens when there is no connection or very poor connection, just briefly, and it's as follows. 5 or 6 years ago, I did a study into the sports technology sector, which is a growing sector. There's some wonderful things coming out of universities in terms of research and development in sports technologies. I wish I had time to go into some fabulous examples of sports tech. At that end of the universities, though, they had very little understanding. I interviewed lots and lots of people as part of that study in universities who were doing wonderful science things. At the other end is Nike and Adidas and other large, organisations, and they had no understanding of how to bridge that gap between new stream and mainstream, and that's an example of what I'll simply call waste. We are now at the University of Melbourne, we're leading a CRC application in human performance and sports technology because there's been a lot of progress so far, and we want to take it from having about that trajectory to having about that trajectory, and it's all about that systematic innovation capability. So I hope that those examples from outside the sector might help you a little bit in thinking about adapting that to inside the defence sector. Next thing I'd like to say is that I've worked for a long time in trying to understand how great organisations decide which of their projects have the most potential. And this is very challenging, and whether it's the mining sector or the pharmaceutical sector, or may I say the defence sector, there's always lots of interesting sounding ideas. The pitches that we had earlier, they all sounded good to me at first. How do we test those ideas, even when we don't know very much about them because they are at the early stage? I've deduced from what the world's best organisations do this list, and I think it can be readily adapted to defence, science and technology. But let me just run through it very quickly. The function test: does the new product and service perform the function at a superior level to however we're doing this now? The marketing test: will it sell? And by the way, when I say will it sell, it's obvious what that means in a commercial market. I'll interpret that for you very briefly in just a moment as to what that means in the defence sector, which is not the same as a commercial market. That's what I mean by us needing to adapt those things. The operations test: well, there's no point just being good at producing a prototype in a laboratory, we have to be able to scale it up, as was alluded to in our first talk this morning. We have to be able to produce thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of them for it to be effective in the mainstream and out in the marketplace. Do we have the right people to make this work successfully? The leadership and people test, it's an obvious one. Is it good value for money? Does it provide a return on the invested funds? And we can adapt that to our sector. Do we have control over all of the intellectual property? And this is where, indeed, we must work with our partners to make sure that we have got control over intellectual property. And that's where we increasingly see these days the open innovation framework, which is really at the core of the whole partnership theme of Syndicate, is becoming the dominant model of how innovation gets done most effectively. So a little bit more about open innovation shortly. Does it make sense with respect to our overall strategy? So that's again saying, does the new stream activities and does the individual project make sense and contribute to the high-level strategy? In that case, it would be our whole of defence strategy. And the eighth test, I've said, is there a new eighth test? Yes, there is. It's the test of sustainable development. Not only does it have to be effective in doing what it does directly, but it's also got to be environmentally and socially and community-wise, at the very least, I'll say acceptable, and in the best of worlds, able to take all those things forward. My example of adapting from the commercial world to the defence world was to take one of those tests, it's all I've got time for today, and just say, let's take the marketing test where, for example, with the next model of the iPhone, the marketing test has obvious meaning. But for us, I'd say in the defence sector, the marketing test could translate and should translate into what I'll call the stakeholder test. We still have to be able to persuade, influence, and if you like, sell the relevant stakeholders across the defence sector, and there are a number of them, that this is going to provide value to them in just the same way as we would want to sell a product or a service in a commercial market, but slightly adapted to the circumstances in the defence sector. So I think they can adapt actually nicely and can be used as a screening test to say which ones do we want to take forward, because we can't afford to take everything forward from the idea stage. We can only have a focused investment strategy. Next thing I'd like to bring to you in terms of these first principles of systematic innovation capability is that it's important to have a short-term, a medium-term and a longer-term approach. Right? And so this is something that I've adapted from some business strategy conceptual frameworks. The Three Horizon framework, I expect that many of you are very familiar with it, but if you adapt that to innovation, it's about extending and defending what we're doing today. It's about building emerging businesses tomorrow, and in innovation land, I would say, let's call that incremental innovation, through to Horizon 3, which is about radical innovation, about moving to things that are completely. So an example of a radical innovation is when we first started doing innovative work in the world of cyber, which is completely different to what we were doing when we weren't doing cyber. It's a completely new and different form, and currently now we're thinking about and doing something about space in our Australian defence sector, and previously we weren't. So that's what I mean by a radical innovation. Just a couple of words to remind you of some business history. When I've said, let's not be Kodak, let's not be Blockbuster or Borders, we want to be Apple, we want to be Federal Express, combining radical innovation with incremental innovation in about the right mix. And by the way, I've studied this in the commercial world. The mix of radical innovation investments and incremental innovations in terms of the investment that goes in is about 50-50. It's actually 45 to 55 in best practice organisations that I've surveyed and studied. So we want to have that balance. And if we don't get that right, then watch out for the Kodak moment that can occur and does occur. The point about a systematic innovation capability is that we can measure our maturity in terms of systematic innovation capability, and I want to say just briefly that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So if we think about the defence sector, and here I'd like to say Army, Navy, Air Force, just like in a commercial organisation, innovation works effectively, I'm going to assert, only when it's based on a quality platform. The organisation needs to be stable before innovation can effectively take hold. My favourite example here is a company that I've already mentioned, I've worked very closely with, it's Toyota. They spent 40 or 50 years getting quality, I won't say perfected, because they would never say perfected, but becoming very mature at what I'll call quality management, which is all about stability, standard operating procedures in the mainstream, which then allows them to have the perspective of the absorptive capacity to take innovations from their new stream and effectively deploy them at mass scale. So innovation capability needs to be built on especially the quality capability, and the efficiency capability is a good thing to have as well, and perhaps or perhaps not, by the way, a flexibility capability can be in there as well. But if there's one thing I've learned over a few decades of studying organisational capability, it's that an effective innovation capability will not be stable and will not take hold unless there is a stable mainstream quality. From my outsiders' observations of the defence sector, I have very good news. And that is, from what I've been able to observe, and I've had 2 or 3 instances where I have worked with DST people and Army people, I think that there is an excellent stability of the mainstream platform in those systems. No one's perfect. I know you know that. Toyota's not perfect, and neither are we in any other organisation. But where we have maturity of that stability, then we can develop an effective system for the absorptive capacity of taking those innovations in from a DST into Army, Navy and Air Force and so on, and then making those play effectively at scale. So we can't skip the quality step, and I think that that plays nicely into exactly where I see, from an outsider's perspective, where I see the defence sector being able to go up that innovation maturity curve effectively. I want to almost conclude, but spend just a couple more minutes saying that as a result of all of the research work that we did, we ended up for the commercial world developing an innovation excellence capability framework. And I just want to very briefly mention, and we can adapt this to the defence sector, I want to very briefly mention what some of the components were of that. Firstly, the drivers of innovation. And we already heard from Alex and from Minister Pyne today as examples of the leadership factor of innovation. There also needs to be, which I've already alluded to, an innovation strategy in place, a focused strategy of this is what we're trying to do, and we can't do everything. So by definition, when we talk about strategy, including innovation strategy, this is what we're focusing on, and that also implies, and we're not doing all of those other things that we might be doing, but this is our strategic focus. Then we have a system. I've talked about an innovation system, and the components of the system in excellent organisations are customer focus, sustainable development, radical and incremental innovation that I've mentioned, which are nicely balanced in that. That's the portfolio piece, the portfolio project. A process for taking those innovations forward. A resourcing of it, and I was just delighted to hear, I hadn't heard all of it before, Minister Pyne saying just what the quantum is and the quality as well as the quality as well as the quantity of the resource that's going in to our defence and system and our defence innovation system. The reason I've coloured the box there as I have is because it refers directly to the partnership approach. So that, as I mentioned, and I want to say it again, an integral part of an innovation capability that becomes systematic is the collaborative open innovation approach. And when I study this with DST, I'm thinking at least 10 and maybe even 12 years ago, it was when DSTO was first getting, as it was called then, was first getting its head around permeating its boundaries and working with partners most effectively. And again, best practice that I'm personally aware of was the DiggerWorks case, which wasn't just about DST working well with the Army, but was also about the whole supply chain of working with private sector providers to end up with that vision and the excellent results that came from it. So it is an integral part of the system. We call it open innovation, and it's really at the heart of the partnerships that we're here to discuss today. And as a result of that, of course, we see the outcomes. I just should probably briefly mention the behaviour and the culture piece, incredibly important, and the preparedness to take carefully thought through and carefully calculated risks. And hopefully if we get that right, as CSL does, and Apple and Google and the other of the usual suspects in the commercial world, then sure enough we can get some fantastic innovation benefits coming out. So We have a scoring methodology and we can actually assess an organisation. I've adapted this from the European Foundation for Quality Management, didn't just make it up. Don't make any of this stuff actually. I just get around and observe best practices. And we have a scoring methodology by which we can do that. So that's been a run through the notion of systematic innovation capability, the different levels of it that if we become truly excellent at it, will connect up each and every person who works in what I'll call the land of innovation in terms of what they're doing at their laboratory bench, the folks that were talking about their pitches before, and their contribution can be connected right through to the big picture of One Defence. So thanks very much for inviting me along today, and I appreciate it. And if there's time for questions, I'll take them. Otherwise...
Well, are you going to be here for the next couple of days?
I'm going to be here all today.
Okay, so maybe take one question now, and then if you're here, other people who might want to engage with you can come and connect. So maybe one question from the floor now? Yep.
Hi, Jeremy from the Doc Systems. There was a lot of content there. How would you advise a 20-person company to try and make content on board?
There's a picture of a book I wrote about everything, and I'm not trying to flog the book. I would say think through, perhaps the first thing to do would be to think through your connection in terms of the news stream and the mainstream, and to think about strategy and the deployment of strategy into projects, and then the involvement of people in projects that come together to deliver the strategy. That's that set of levels that I spoke about before. Do you have those connections in place? And if I could add one other thing to that, it's the old saying from the field of operations management that I've worked in for a long time, and that is make sure you've got measures in place for all of those things. And the old saying is, what gets measured gets done. So at the strategic level, at the project level, and at the individual behaviour level, develop and implement and monitor and control measures of those things, and that'll show everybody that you're actually serious about it. Thank you.
Well, before we give you one final sort of round of applause and thanks, Danny, I wanted to give you this as a token of our appreciation on behalf of DST and Syndicate. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much.